Hi, I'm Victoria. When my brother slid the papers across the table and said, "Just sign here, we already planned everything," I felt my stomach drop. The pen was uncapped, waiting. They didn't ask how I was coping after Mom's death. They didn't ask if I needed time. They only wanted one thing: the money. For a moment, I just looked out the window. Rain was falling softly, streaking down the glass like tiny tears. The quiet rhythm of the drops somehow echoed the turmoil in my chest. My siblings, Thomas and Emily, were smiling at me, their faces casual, but there was something in their eyes I had seen before: calculation. Their voices were calm, but the words carried the weight of entitlement. I realized then that my mother's death had shifted something fundamental. I had lost her, but they were determined to claim what she had left behind, as if grief justified greed. The realization hit harder than any argument or accusation ever could. I was no longer their sister. I was an account number. My name is Laura. I'm 47. I never married, not for lack of love, but because life had different plans. I worked at the local library, enjoyed quiet routines, and cherished small moments of peace. All that changed the day my mother passed away. Mom, Margaret, had raised 3 children alone after Dad died. She was gentle, patient, and quiet, a woman who expressed love through actions rather than words. When she fell and broke her hip, I moved her in with me immediately. No discussion, no arguments. I just said, "Come live with me," and she smiled, as if she had expected it all along. We had grown close in those months. I learned her routines, her habits, the subtle ways she communicated even as her memory faltered. I became her anchor, and in return, she became my reason to stay grounded. Caring for her was not burdensome, it was a privilege. I knew one day this time would become a memory I would hold dear, but I never imagined that memory would become a weapon in the hands of my own family. When Mom passed away in her sleep, the world felt hollow. I walked through her room, touching her quilt, her teacups, her favorite books, and each item whispered memories of her presence. At the will reading, the lawyer called my name, and my heart skipped a beat. Everything, her house, her savings, her investments, was entrusted to me. Over $1 million. The room fell silent. Emily gasped, Thomas frowned. I tried to smile, but the weight of what this meant pressed down like a stone on my chest. It was not just about money, it was about responsibility, trust, and the fragile memory of a woman who had believed in me completely. For a few brief days, my siblings acted as though nothing had changed. They hugged me, thanked me, and said kind words. But beneath the smiles, there was something I could sense. They were planning, and I would soon see just how far they were willing to go. The first sign came subtly. Emily started talking about vacations, suggesting cruises and luxury trips, always phrased as wonderful ideas. Thomas joked about investments, casually hinting at ways to enjoy money they hadn't earned. Their words were gentle, almost polite, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to claim what had been entrusted to me. I remember the evening they brought the cruise brochure to dinner. It was glossy, bright, inviting, a world away from the quiet grief I was feeling. Emily placed it in front of me, smiling, while Thomas leaned back in his chair, eyes watching me carefully. "Mom would have loved this," he said. Their tone was soft, but the message was sharp. Sign or be left out. I looked at them and felt the cold edge of betrayal. "I'm not comfortable using this money for a trip like that," I said quietly. The room went still. Their smiles faltered, and the warmth vanished. That was when I realized something painful but unavoidable. They were not mourning. They were scheming. And I was about to enter a battle I never imagined I would face. This was the beginning. Not of revenge, not of anger, but of a quiet, patient fight. a fight to protect my mother's trust, to preserve integrity, and to navigate a family that had revealed its true intentions. And in that moment, I understood the journey ahead would test not only my resolve, but the strength of my own heart. The days after the will reading were strange, quiet, heavy, and slow. I tried to return to my routine, as if the world hadn't shifted under my feet, but nothing felt normal anymore. The house felt emptier, though it was full of my mother's things. Her books stacked neatly on the shelves, her teacups in the cabinet, her favorite quilt folded on the couch. Every item was a reminder of her presence, and now of the responsibility she had entrusted to me. I carried her trust like a fragile vase in my hands, aware that any misstep could shatter it. My siblings, Thomas and Emily, began to change in ways I hadn't expected. At first, they tried to act normal, laughing at dinner and talking about mundane things, but slowly, subtle comments slipped in. Thomas would casually mention trips he always wanted to take, or joke about investments that could make our lives easier. Emily started sending me articles about cruises and luxury resorts, always ending with a question like, "Wouldn't this be amazing?" They smiled when they said it, but the eyes, those calculating eyes, told a different story. Their voices were calm, but the words carried the weight of entitlement. Their smiles didn't reach their hearts, and I could feel it. Their words felt like probes, testing how far they could push me. I tried to push it off at first. I told myself they were grieving too, that their behavior was a way to cope with our mother's death. But slowly it became clear. This was not about coping. This was about entitlement. They were no longer talking to me as a sister. They were talking as if I were a gatekeeper to money they believed they deserved, and they were determined to get it, no matter what it took. One evening, they invited me over for dinner, saying they wanted to celebrate Mom. I remember sitting at the table, the familiar smell of roasted chicken and garlic filling the air, trying to imagine that it was the same family I had grown up with. The house was immaculate, as always, but it felt foreign. At the end of the meal, Emily brought out a glossy brochure of a luxury cruise. It showed sparkling pools, private balconies, gourmet restaurants, and endless blue oceans stretching into the horizon. She placed it gently in front of me, her fingers lingering just a little too long. "We already priced it," she said with a tight smile. Thomas leaned back in his chair, exuding casual confidence, and added, "Mom always wanted us to enjoy life." I looked down at the brochure, my heart tightening. This was not a request or a suggestion. This was a plan to spend my inheritance before I had even considered it. The realization hit me like a cold wave. They were not mourning. They were scheming. They were trying to take what was mine under the guise of family fun. For a moment, I wanted to speak up, to yell, to tell them exactly what I thought, but I didn't. Instead, I held my voice inside me, as I had held my mother's hand through her nights of fear. I said softly, "I'm not comfortable using this money for a trip like that." The room changed instantly. The warmth vanished. Emily's smile faltered. Thomas's relaxed posture stiffened. Silence fell heavy and suffocating. Then Emily leaned forward and said, "Laura, don't be difficult." Difficult? That word, so casual, cut deeper than anger could have. Thomas added, "You don't have kids. You don't need all that money anyway." Their words were not only cruel, they were dismissive of everything I had done, of all the nights I spent caring for our mother, of the loyalty I had shown. I swallowed the lump in my throat, trying to maintain composure. "Mom left it to me. I'm not ready to give it away," I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. 2 days later, I received a letter from a law firm. Not just a casual inquiry, but a formal challenge. They were contesting the will. They claimed my mother was confused, that I had somehow influenced her. My hands shook as I held the paper at the kitchen table. The air felt heavier than ever, thick with betrayal. It was no longer about a cruise or money, it was about control, about a sense of ownership my siblings thought they had. I sat for hours, staring out the window at the rain streaking down the glass, trying to calm the storm in my chest. My home, once a sanctuary, felt like a courtroom waiting to happen, and I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I could not let them take this from me. The following week, I met with a lawyer named Susan. She was calm, intelligent, and quietly determined, the kind of person who gives you confidence simply by being present. I laid out everything: Thomas's casual threats, Emily's manipulations, the cruise brochure, and the letter from the law firm. Susan listened carefully, taking notes, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she looked at me and said softly, "Your mother was very clear in her intentions. This will is strong. You did nothing wrong." For the first time in days, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Not completely, but enough to breathe again. From that moment on, everything shifted. I stopped trying to reason with Thomas and Emily. I stopped hoping they would act like family. Every message, every casual remark about vacations or inheritance became a reminder of what I was protecting. Not just money, but my mother's trust. And though it was painful, though the loneliness grew, a small seed of clarity took root inside me. I understood now: this battle would not be loud, it would be quiet, patient, and firm. And if I lost my family along the way, I had to accept that as part of the cost for honoring my mother. The following weeks felt endless. Every morning I woke up, I could already feel the weight of their plans pressing down on me. Thomas called frequently, his tone casual but sharp. "You know, Laura, it's just easier if we sort this out quietly," he said once, leaving the words hanging like a noose I couldn't see. Emily followed with texts that looked innocent. "I found another cruise package. It's beautiful. Would you consider it?" The polite phrasing hid the sting. They weren't asking, they were testing me. Each message chipped away at my patience, but I forced myself to remain calm. My mother's trust deserved more than impulsive reactions. It deserved a quiet, steady defense. I started a journal, not for anyone else, but to hold my own thoughts together. Every insult disguised as concern, every veiled threat, I wrote down. Every suggestion of fairness that really meant "take your money," I recorded. It helped me breathe. When I read the journal, I realized how little they knew about my mother's life, her intentions, and her wishes. They had never visited her every day, never spent nights watching over her, never held her hand when she trembled. They only remembered the image they wanted to preserve of themselves: kind, generous, innocent. But the truth was different. Theirs was not generosity, it was a claim disguised as entitlement. One evening, I received a particularly bold email from Emily. She wrote, "Laura, Mom always wanted us to enjoy life. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You know we only want what's fair." Fair. What they meant by fair was not the same as what my mother had written. Their fairness was convenience. Their fairness was a cruise. Their fairness was spending money they had never earned. I folded the email and placed it in a drawer, feeling a cold tightness in my chest. I knew then that words alone would not stop them. Their desire was louder than their respect. They were determined, and their determination was subtle but deadly. Then came the formal challenge. The letter from the law firm was polite, precise, and merciless. It claimed my mother's memory had faltered, that I had unduly influenced her, that she was confused when she wrote her will. The paper was heavy in my hands, but the weight was not just on paper, it was in my heart. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the raindrops sliding down the window pane, feeling the quiet betrayal seep in. It was not just a fight for money anymore. It was a battle to protect my mother's memory, her integrity, and the trust she had placed in me. And the reality settled in. I could not fight this with anger. I had to fight with clarity. Susan, my lawyer, became my anchor. We met almost every day in those first weeks, reviewing letters, photographs, and my mother's personal notes. She guided me carefully, teaching me how to answer questions calmly, how to remain composed, and how to preserve evidence of my mother's intentions. One day, she asked me to recount every detail of caregiving I had done for my mother over the past 2 years. I spoke, slowly, each word carrying the weight of late nights, early mornings, and quiet sacrifices. "You were there for her in ways no one else was," Susan said softly, "and that makes your account truthful and credible. You are not guilty of influence. You are truthful by default." Her words soothed me, but they also reminded me how alone I was in this fight. Only truth could protect me against a tide of greed disguised as family concern. The tension escalated when Thomas visited my home unannounced. I was sitting at the kitchen table with Susan's notes spread out before me when he knocked. I knew immediately why he had come. He smiled, overly casual, and said, "Laura, we need to talk. We don't want this to get ugly." I invited him in, my voice calm but firm. "This isn't a discussion. The will is clear. Your claims are unfounded." He leaned against the counter, hands folded, eyes calculating. "We just want a little compromise," he said. "Mom wouldn't have wanted hard feelings." I looked at him and I felt the sting of his words. They were never about Mom. They were about what they wanted. "Mom trusted me," I said quietly. "That trust is not negotiable." He left without another word, but his departure left a heavier silence than his presence ever could. Emily escalated next. She began contacting mutual friends, spreading subtle rumors about my caregiving, about my control over Mom, about how I had isolated her from the rest of the family. Each message was calculated, carefully framed to appear like concern, but I could see through the facade. I learned that manipulation could be soft, almost invisible, and that sometimes the cruelest words are the ones whispered behind a smile. I kept each message, each call, each insinuation documented, not out of obsession, but to preserve the truth. In every letter, I could trace their intentions, their greed, their betrayal. As court dates approached, the weight of silence pressed down. Friends reached out, asking if I was okay. I would nod and smile, but inside I was bracing for confrontation. I spent nights reading my mother's letters, her notes, the careful instructions she left. Each word reminded me of why I had to endure this quiet cruelty. Each word reminded me that my mother had trusted me to carry her legacy, and that trust was more valuable than anything in the world. Money, family, reputation, they all paled in comparison to the honor of keeping her wishes intact. Then, a week before the first hearing, Thomas made his final attempt at manipulation. He called, his voice measured, trying to sound casual. "Laura, can we settle this quietly? You don't need to involve lawyers. We can avoid embarrassment, for everyone's sake." I listened, my hands gripping the phone tightly, and said nothing for a long moment. "The lawyer is already involved," I finally said, "and it's too late for quiet." He sighed, frustration bleeding into his voice, and ended the call. In that silence, I realized something crucial. Their plans, their schemes, their manipulation could not shake me. Only clarity and truth could. By the time the first deposition arrived, the tension had become almost unbearable. Every knock on the door, every email notification, every call felt like a reminder that I was under scrutiny, that my family had weaponized their trust in my heart against me. Sitting in that stark room, under the watchful eyes of attorneys and cameras, I felt my heart beat fast, but I also felt a strange calm. This was my moment to tell the truth, and no amount of manipulation or insinuation could take that away from me. I was not only protecting my inheritance, I was protecting the memory of my mother, and in doing so, I was protecting myself. The morning of the hearing arrived like a quiet storm. Not a sudden burst of anger or chaos, but a heavy, unrelenting tension that settled over everything. I woke early, hours before the courthouse opened, and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, my mother's letter folded neatly beside me. The words she had written, words of trust, clarity, and love, were my armor. I reread them slowly, savoring each line, letting the calm seep into my chest. This was the day that would test everything I had prepared for, and I knew I had to remain steady, even as my family's intentions loomed large. The drive to the courthouse was silent. Rain drizzled down the windshield, the rhythm of water against glass echoing the quiet dread inside me. Every street, every familiar corner felt heavy with anticipation. I kept my hands folded in my lap, gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor me against the storm I was about to face. Thomas and Emily had arrived earlier, I knew. They would sit together, plotting, hoping to see fear or hesitation in me. But I had rehearsed my responses, counted the words, and steeled myself with the knowledge that truth had weight far stronger than manipulation. Inside, the courtroom smelled of polished wood, paper, and quiet tension. The judge, an older man with gentle eyes, looked up from his bench as everyone filed in. His presence was calm but commanding, a reminder that this was not a battle of emotion but of evidence and truth. My mother's lawyer, Susan, sat beside me, her calm demeanor radiating confidence. Every note she took, every slight nod, reassured me that I was not alone, and yet the room itself felt heavy, as if the walls absorbed every intention, every whispered plan. The hearing began with procedural formalities. Thomas's lawyer spoke first, weaving a story carefully designed to paint me as controlling and unkind. They emphasized my mother's occasional forgetfulness, suggesting I had manipulated her decisions, steered her intentions, and isolated her from the rest of the family. I listened without interruption, noting the pauses, the carefully chosen words, the insinuations that hid beneath polite phrasing. My chest tightened, but I did not speak. I reminded myself, truth has its own rhythm, and I would let it unfold, slowly, steadily, without haste. Then Susan arose. She did not rush. She spoke in a calm, steady voice, highlighting the daily care I had provided my mother, the nights spent soothing her fears, the mornings ensuring she took her medications, the hours of patience when confusion clouded her mind. She presented evidence, logs, photos, letters, and witness statements from my mother's doctors and advisors. Every piece was methodically laid out, each fact quietly dismantling the narrative my family's lawyer had built. The courtroom felt different with each document. Weight shifted, subtle but undeniable. The air seemed to become lighter, and I felt the first taste of relief. When it was my turn to speak, I walked slowly to the stand. My hands were steady, though my heart raced. The oath was administered, and I repeated the words carefully, committing to tell the truth. The first questions were simple: dates, routines, caregiving schedules. I answered clearly, deliberately, speaking not to accuse but to clarify. Each word was a bridge between my mother's intentions and the reality I had witnessed. As I spoke, I could feel the courtroom leaning into me. Not everyone, but some faces softened, as if truth itself was a quiet presence, undeniable and patient. Then came the crucial questions. Thomas's lawyer tried to rattle me, asking about moments of frustration, questioning whether I had influenced my mother's decisions. I paused, thinking of the countless nights I held her hand, the careful notes she had written herself, the clarity in her words. I never influenced her, I said, quietly but firmly. I honored her wishes. Every day I followed her instructions. She trusted me. That trust guided every decision. My voice did not tremble. The silence that followed spoke louder than any shout could have. Emily's turn was next, her polished composure cracking in small, almost imperceptible ways. Susan asked simple, precise questions: how often Emily had visited, whether she had assisted with daily care, if she had ever influenced my mother. She hesitated, fumbled with dates, contradicted herself in minor ways that Susan gently but firmly highlighted. The cracks in her story widened, not dramatically, but quietly, inexorably. Every small pause, every subtle contradiction was a stone in the foundation of truth, carefully placed and building an undeniable case. Thomas finally spoke. He tried to frame his argument around fairness, appealing to emotions, to shared memories of childhood. Susan asked if he had ever discussed cruise plans or other expenditures with Emily before contesting the will. His answer came reluctantly, quietly. Yes. Susan asked for clarification. Before or after involving lawyers? He faltered. Before, he admitted. The courtroom absorbed the words like water into stone. Their plan, their scheme, had been exposed, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through careful truth-telling and observation. As the judge reviewed the evidence, including emails, letters, and witness statements, the atmosphere shifted. No one needed to shout, no one needed to dramatize. The truth was present in its own quiet authority. When the recess was called, I sat quietly, absorbing the relief. Susan whispered, "It's over. The evidence speaks for itself." Relief settled in my chest, but it was tempered with reflection. This was never about victory. It was about honoring my mother, protecting her trust, and preserving integrity. I had done that. I had kept my promise. When the final ruling was announced, the judge spoke with calm precision. The will was upheld, the challenge was dismissed, every claim against me was invalidated. My mother's intentions were honored. The words were soft but absolute. There was no celebration, no gloating. I simply exhaled, feeling the weight of weeks, months, and years lift slightly. My family walked past me afterwards. Emily avoided my gaze. Thomas looked tired, subdued. I felt neither triumph nor revenge. I felt the quiet, unshakable relief of truth finally acknowledged. Afterwards, outside the courthouse, the air was damp with rain. The sky was gray, but lighter than it had been in the morning. I stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the quiet wash over me. The truth had emerged. The letters, the memories, the care I had given, all validated. And while relationships with Thomas and Emily would remain strained, the knowledge that I had acted honorably, that I had respected my mother, was unshakable. Justice, I realized, is sometimes quiet, patient, and steady, not loud, not dramatic, but unwavering. After the court decision, life did not suddenly feel lighter. The heavy air of tension had lifted, yes, but in its place came a strange quiet that was both relieving and unsettling. I returned home that evening, stepping over the threshold as though it were a border between two worlds, one of manipulation and worry, the other of calm, cautious peace. My house smelled the same, familiar and comforting. Books lined the shelves, the kettle sat on the stove, and the faint aroma of lavender from my mother's sachets lingered. But every sound, every shadow felt sharper now, as if the quiet was waiting to remind me of everything I had endured. I spent the first few days after the ruling reflecting. I walked through the rooms she had loved, touching her furniture, her quilts, the small items she had cherished. Each object carried memory and trust. I remembered her soft voice, her quiet laughter, the way she would ask questions about my day without rushing, without judgment. She had trusted me, and I had honored her. That thought became a steady anchor for my emotions, a reminder that even if my family could not see the truth, the weight of my mother's confidence rested firmly in my hands. Yet the loneliness was heavy. Thomas and Emily did not reach out. Their absence was deafening. Phone calls went unanswered, messages remained unread. It was as if the courtroom had built an invisible wall between us, not through confrontation, but through the quiet shame of being exposed. Part of me ached for the family I had hoped to have, the connection I had imagined, but another part of me felt relief. I no longer needed to convince them of my intentions, defend my love for Mom, or explain the care I had provided. The truth had spoken for itself, and that truth was enough. To cope with the emptiness, I focused on daily routines. I cooked meals slowly, savoring the act itself. I walked in the mornings, letting the crisp air fill my lungs and quiet my thoughts. I spent hours in the library, reading letters my mother had written over the years, noting her handwriting, the pauses in her words, the careful expressions of love and trust. Each letter reminded me why I had fought so hard, not for money, not for recognition, but for the respect of a woman who had trusted me unconditionally. I also reached out to close friends, but carefully. I did not want pity, only companionship. They listened as I recounted the courtroom, the letters, the betrayal. They offered comfort, not solutions, and that felt right. Comfort was all I needed. I did not need them to solve the mess my family had created. I only needed them to witness my experience, to affirm that I had acted with honesty, patience, and care. Over time, the anger and frustration began to soften into a quiet awareness. I realized that Thomas and Emily's actions were never about me personally. They were about greed, entitlement, and a lack of understanding. They had misjudged the measure of love and responsibility, assuming that money equaled loyalty. I could not change their values, but I could protect myself and honor my mother, and that realization brought a kind of peace I had not expected. I took steps to secure the inheritance thoughtfully. I met with a financial advisor not to indulge myself, but to follow my mother's intentions responsibly. I paid off debts, organized savings for emergencies, and allocated a portion to charities supporting caregiving and elder care, causes that had mattered deeply to my mother. Each decision I made was quiet and deliberate. There were no grand gestures, no announcements, only careful choices that reflected my values and her trust. Even as time passed, I occasionally received messages from Thomas or Emily. Some were attempts at reconciliation, some veiled reminders of past grievances. I read them and folded them away. I did not respond immediately. I realized that forgiveness does not require immediate dialogue. Sometimes it is a silent acceptance, a decision to release resentment without surrendering integrity. That choice became a daily practice, and with it came a new kind of strength. One afternoon, months after the ruling, I visited my mother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the air thick with soft sunlight and the faint scent of flowers. I placed a bouquet of lilies she had always loved and sat beside the stone, letting the calm seep into me. I spoke aloud, not to anyone, not even to my mother, but to myself. I honored your wishes. I did what you trusted me to do. There was no voice from the sky, no sudden warmth, only calm, only peace, and that, I realized, was enough. Slowly, I rebuilt my emotional life. I allowed myself to enjoy simple pleasures again, a walk in the park, cooking a favorite meal, reading without guilt. I no longer carried the constant tension of anticipating manipulation. I learned that boundaries are not walls, they are lifelines. They protect not just possessions, but hearts and memories. I had drawn my lines gently, firmly, and with integrity, and in doing so, I had preserved what mattered most. Thomas and Emily never fully reconciled. Emily remained distant, preferring to keep her life separate. Thomas reached out occasionally, short calls, polite messages, but the closeness we had once known was altered, and I accepted that. I realized family is not defined solely by shared blood, but by shared respect, trust, and honesty. Some bonds cannot be restored entirely, but that does not diminish the value of integrity or peace. I also discovered an unexpected sense of independence. For the first time in years, I felt fully responsible for my own life and choices. The court had affirmed the truth of my actions, but it was my own decision to act with patience, honesty, and courage that gave me freedom. I learned that strength is not loud or aggressive. Strength is quiet, deliberate, and consistent, especially when facing betrayal from those closest to you. If there is one lesson I carry now, it is this: love and responsibility are intertwined, but they are not bargaining chips. Trust is precious, and when it is placed in your hands, it deserves respect above all else. The inheritance, the court, the confrontation, they were not about victory. They were about honoring what mattered, protecting the integrity of those we love, and allowing ourselves the grace to act with truth, patience, and dignity. And in that grace, I found a calm I had not known I could have, a quiet strength that no betrayal, no manipulation, no greed could ever take from me. The days after the resolution passed slowly, like sunlight moving across a quiet room. The courtroom drama, the letters, the emails, the manipulation, it all belonged to the past now, yet the echoes remained. I walked through the house and noticed small things I had forgotten to appreciate in the chaos. The way the morning light hit my mother's favorite chair, the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet, the faint scent of her lavender sachets. These were reminders not of loss, but of presence, of trust honored, and of the quiet life I had preserved. I did not hear from Emily or Thomas for weeks. At first, that silence felt heavy, almost painful, but as the days passed, I realized that their absence was no longer a weight. I had released the need for approval or reconciliation. I had learned that forgiveness does not require interaction. Forgiveness can be a silent act, a choice to let go of resentment while maintaining your integrity. And in that quiet forgiveness, I felt freedom I had never known before. I began focusing on my life in new ways. I revisited old hobbies, spent long afternoons reading, and allowed myself to enjoy simple moments I had once overlooked. I took walks in the park, observing families, children, and the quiet rhythm of life moving on. Occasionally, I would think of Thomas and Emily, not with bitterness, but with understanding that people are often limited by their own desires and fears. Their choices reflected them, not me. I could not control their actions, only my own. The inheritance, once the source of tension, became a tool for meaning rather than conflict. I set aside portions for responsible investment, emergency funds, and a small charitable foundation supporting caregivers and the elderly. It was not grand or publicized, no announcement, no recognition, but each decision honored my mother's wishes and the trust she had placed in me. I realized that true value lies not in wealth, but in purpose, care, and the quiet impact one can have on others' lives. One morning, I stood by my mother's grave. The air was cool, the sunlight soft, and the flowers I had brought swayed gently in the breeze. I spoke aloud, not expecting a response, but needing to acknowledge the journey. "I did my best," I said softly. "I honored you, I kept your trust, and I learned to honor myself as well." No words from the past, no apologies from my siblings were necessary. The act of speaking my truth, of standing firm in integrity, was enough. I could finally release the weight I had carried for so long. As I walked back to my car, the quiet streets felt gentle, forgiving. Life was moving on, slowly, deliberately, and I would move with it, not chasing validation, not fearing manipulation, but living with the calm confidence that comes from knowing you acted with truth and care. I realized that betrayal, while painful, can teach profound lessons about boundaries, about the value of honesty, and about the strength of quiet resilience. Sometimes people asked me if the court victory had changed me. I would smile softly and shake my head. The ruling had been necessary, but it did not define me. What defined me was the choice I made every day, to act with integrity, to protect those I loved, and to honor their memory through patience and care. Money, court battles, and family disputes are fleeting. What lasts is the strength built through quiet perseverance and truth. Thomas and Emily remain part of my life in limited ways, though the closeness we once had cannot be fully restored, and that is okay. I have learned that love, even within family, must be balanced with respect and honesty. Some bonds can survive strain, others cannot. The important thing is to preserve your own values, your own peace, and your own sense of self. That is the inheritance worth holding on to. If there is one lesson I carry now, it is this: truth is patient, integrity is quiet, and boundaries are not walls, they are lifelines. Protecting what is entrusted to you is not selfish, it is honorable. Standing firm in the face of betrayal may feel lonely, but it also cultivates the strength, clarity, and calm that cannot be taken away by manipulation, greed, or circumstance. And in the end, peace is not loud. Peace arrives quietly, like sunlight through a window. It is soft, steady, and unshakable. I found mine in honoring my mother, in trusting myself, and in letting go of what I cannot control. That is how I live now, with calm confidence, quiet gratitude, and the knowledge that integrity is its own reward.